Right.
I'm David Corn.
And I'm Jim Pinkerton.
Together we're
bloggingheads.tv once again.
And once again, but last again, that is last time before the big day, next Tuesday. Although, people are voting already, it seems.
Right. I read a Pew Center poll that had that 15% of the public's already voted.
Yeah, and I heard something on Anderson Cooper at 360. I don't know why not 180 or 270, but in which he said that somebody said that a third of American voters will vote early. That struck me as awfully high. That's a lot of people voting early. What if there's a last-minute surprise? What if Osama comes out and says, "I'll turn myself in if Barack Obama is elected," but he only says it on Monday. I mean,
what if Bin Laden says, "I'll turn myself in," but only if McCain's elected?
Either way.
I mean, that would be a kind of a changer.
Yeah,
but maybe it'd be too late. Maybe,
I guess there are some people who just, who don't want to be involved in any cliffhanger. They want to get it out of the way early. These are the people who probably go Christmas shopping in July. I mean, I think a lot of people probably go voting early because they're afraid of these long lines and problems. And it really should be. It really should be that you should be able to go vote and get in and out of any voting place inside of 10, 15 minutes.
I agree. I think that's a reform for the future, is to have some system that guarantees that. I mean, a lot of people I know are struggling to figure out when they can vote and so on, because they're afraid of being there Tuesday. Although for all we know, it'll be empty Tuesday. Maybe everybody will have voted by then.
Okay, so before we talk about the next administration,
which I'm sure you'll be playing a major part in.
Oh, no doubt, yes. I'll tell you the job I want. I want to be head of INR at State, this little small intelligence agency within the State Department, mainly analytical, but I don't think I'm up for anything. Don't worry about it.
And David, as I was going to say, I'm your friend, and I will just say this, though we disagree on a lot of things ideologically, you couldn't possibly do worse in INR than some of your predecessors.
Well, I'll put that down as a reference when I submit my application.
Actually, I guess they were one of the better ones, weren't they? But they were one of the ones.
Well, they got a bunch of things right on a rock. So
right.
They were better in that regard. They were less
so the Office of Special Plan. So there's one where
I'm staying away from that one if it even survives. But any big thoughts before the election? I mean, I just have one, which isn't even that unique. I'm sorry to say, but it seems to me at this stage in time, we've basically. We as a country, we as an electorate, have gone through everything now. We've seen these candidates for up to 2 years in action, debating. We've seen them actually be somewhat tested in the last, month and a half on the financial meltdown. And we've seen them each make the biggest decision they had to make, which was picking a running mate. And we've heard the arguments ad nauseum, and we've watched the TV ads. It seems to me everything's kind of in place. The public has all the information it needs to know at this point to make a somewhat informed decision. And more importantly, we pundits have all the information we need to make a prediction, or to at least analyze what's been going on, except for one factor, which is what we began, I think, talking about early on in this contest, and that is race. Right now, all the indicators, it looks like it's a wave, not just an election, but a wave election. If you look at what's happening in a lot of Senate races around the country, you look at the fact that even Arizona seems to be in play for McCain, his home state. I mean, these elections come around every once in a while. It seems like a wave election, and the only thing we don't know is whether race will or won't be a factor in terms of people not voting for Barack Obama at the end of the day.
And
there's no way to measure that until we actually
except for with the early indicators you already see. I mean, as I started to say earlier, the Pew Center has a poll showing that among those Americans who voted, Obama's winning, I think, by 19 points, which is pretty thumping. I mean, which would suggest that to the extent that there's a racial angle here, and I'm fully aware of the Bradley effect and so on. Although I think, as I said in the past on Blogging Heads, I think that the Bradley effect was sort of sussed out of the electorate by Reverend Wright. In other words, if Reverend Wright kind of gave you permission, if you were a white of a certain orientation, to think, okay, if Obama doesn't like me, I don't like him. And I don't think there's any reason to be shy about it after the Reverend Wright stuff. If that was going to be,
of course, Obama has never said he doesn't like white people.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying as a phenomenon. I think what does seem to be happening is that according to the Pew Center, is that Obama is winning by 19 points again among people who voted. So there's a much bigger margin than any poll I've seen. Right. So again, it's entirely a function of, or could be entirely a function of self-selection. As in the most motivated people are voting the earliest. It could be that the models involving turnout and who's voting and who's not. It wouldn't shock me totally to think that black turnout is double what it normally is, and it wouldn't shock me totally if white middle-class male turnout is way low, because McCain has obviously failed to energize them, and I think even Palin hasn't fully energized.
You know, it's hard for a grumpy white guy to energize other grumpy white guys. There's something about the dynamic there that just doesn't really work. I'm grumpy, go vote. You grumpy people, go vote.
Well, anger is good, but the problem is that the anger is typically directed at an incumbent. Yeah, and McCain has had to kind of try to run this third way campaign. I'm not Bush and I'm not Obama. Well, I mean, maybe, but it's clear the voters don't necessarily agree with his own self-analysis.
And what's been interesting to me is, at the end of the day here, it seems to me that the Republican campaign has really decided that their best bet is to just raise all the old shibboleths about Democrats, and it's less so talking about John McCain, but attacking Barack Obama for what? For being a socialist, for being weak on national security, for being another tax and spend Democrat. Obama's tax plan, if you put it next to McCain's tax plan, certainly gives more. The Tax Policy Center and others, people who not run the numbers better than you and I do, say that there's more tax relief to the middle class than under Obama's plan than under McCain's plan. But yet they keep coming on and saying, well, he's going to raise your taxes, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. And it doesn't, at this stage, appear to be working. The old Republican playbook that you should be afraid of Democrats because they're just going to take your money and spend them on stupid things. After 8 years of Bush, it doesn't seem to have the resonance that it used to have.
Well, I will say this, and that is...
I mean, listen, calling Barack Obama a socialist, which is what Sarah Palin's doing every single day, when her state is the most socialistic state in the Union. The assumption there is that they collectively own the oil wealth, they let big bad oil companies exploit it, and then they cut a tax to everybody, a check, to everybody, because they share the wealth. And then she goes out there and she's calling Obama a socialist because he wants to raise taxes, a slight bit on the rich to give more to the middle class. I mean, if it works, it will work. But right now, it seems kind of nutty.
Okay, I don't think that Obama is a socialist. It is clear, however, that he's got many associations in the past with scurvy figures, from Reverend Wright to Bill Ayers to Louis Farrakhan to the Mayor Daley political machine.
Mayor Daley was no socialist, my friend.
I think you're right, he was no socialist, but I'm saying there's associations in the past that I think the McCain campaign missed a colossal opportunity from their point of view, and I realize you're not a McCain supporter, to increase the likelihood of them winning this election. I mean, when you see, for example, that...
Well, they've done the Bill Ayers thing. Sarah Palin gets out there and says he's palling around with terrorists, using the present tense and the plural form. Not true. Palling around, if he sat on a board a few years ago with one guy who was once a domestic radical who then became an education expert. But anyway, they tried. They tried on that association and went nowhere.
Well, first of all, I think Bill Ayers still is a domestic radical. I mean, not a terrorist, but a domestic radical. I mean, by his own account. I think
working with establishment organizations like the AND.
You're right. I'm saying, if 6 months ago the McCain campaign had sat down and said, look, the only way we're going to win this election is by painting Obama as a product of the Chicago daily political machine and a product of the left-wing culture of Hyde Park as a neighborhood in Chicago. I think they would have said, okay, every day beginning in March or April, whenever, I mean, I guess McCain pretty much clinched the nomination in March, and I guess it was a pretty good bet that it was a guarantee that Obama or Hillary would be the nominee, so they could have had a double-barreled campaign going on. And they tied Obama to all these people that I mentioned before. I think they would have had an effective campaign. But I think it's not effective if you do it in the last week or so. And I'll give you an example. There's a lot of people who would be very concerned about Obama if they knew that he was somehow connected to this Professor Khalidi.
You mean the same professor who got a grant from the International Republican Institute when John McCain was a member of chaired its board?
There's a lot. I mean, again, there's a lot of people who would be concerned. A lot of people would wonder what
he had as much to do with him as McCain's.
Well, okay, fine. Then let's sort that out. Point is,
here's what I make my point.
What I guarantee won't work is to bring it out in the last week. It might have worked if they brought it out 6 months ago. The issue is creating a narrative, is creating a construct through a prism through which to see Obama. Now, you can't have Palin saying things that are sort of stretching things a little bit to say palling around with terrorists. You can say that Obama served on a board with Bill Ayers, wrote a blurb for his book, seems to have had some pretty close connection with Ayers in the 90s.
Right.
And that would have been a portrait of Obama as somebody who has too many fringe associations. Now,
well, this stuff plays out both ways, Jim, because then you could the Democrats could have focused even more on how John McCain used to pal around with Pinochet and used to hang out with the World Anti-Communist League, which had a bunch of anti-Semitic chapters throughout the world, and so what does that say about John McCain? I mean, these associations, of course, there's always Charles Keating, if you want to get into the associations game, it goes back and forth. I really think, I understand what you're saying in terms of timing and creating a narrative, but I think at this point, the electorate wanted more than these sort of politics. And, they certainly, the air stuff has been done from day one. Hillary did it too, and it just didn't have an impact. People just don't care. They're looking for something more this time around.
Well, I think part of it is that of course, is that McCain, who I think in his mind has never decided if he wants to be a victor or a martyr. I guess he just thinks there's sort of a appeal to him in both.
He's no martyr. I think part of it is he's got the sort of noble streak running through him that had him defending John Kerry against the Swift voters in 2004. But he's certainly dropped that.
He has dropped.
He's on a campaign in the last couple of weeks.
He's right. In the last couple of weeks, I agree with you. If 6 months ago or so, when that radio talk show host in Ohio said we're here to denounce Barack Hussein Obama, and McCain shot him down. And frankly, if McCain had really wanted to win this election, he wouldn't have. He would have had Hussein.
It seems to me that you're saying, if he had taken the somewhat of the low road, but had done it effectively from an earlier point in time, he might have had success. Let me give you an alternative scenario. I think the only key for McCain that would have given him a shot of winning, and we're assuming, we're both talking here as if he's going to lose on Tuesday. Well, let's just go with that assumption because in some ways it makes for the better conversation. If Obama loses, I don't know what we're going to do.
Well, we need your job.
Yes. But it seems to me that his one shot at this was really realizing that it was not his year. That for all the obvious reasons, after 8 years of Bush and after seeing that it looked like a wave election, that he could not win, with everything being equal. So all he could do really was go out there and be the best John McCain he could be. The John McCain that I and others used to like, that had a good reputation, that was jolly, that was the happy warrior, and that said things that were inconvenient and actually was more of a straight shooter than your average politician. Not always a straight shooter, but more of a straight shooter. And wait for one of two things to happen. Either for there to be such a big racial bias in this country that Barack Obama couldn't overcome that, or for external circumstances to give him the opportunity to show his mettle, show his leadership, or at least to raise questions about that of Barack Obama. And have a campaign run by people who understood the John McCain brand. whether whether it was truly authentic or not. Instead, he kind of gave his campaign over to the Karov Bush operatives who went to a standard Republican playbook that really cut against everything that people ever liked about John McCain. And it put him in a real bind. He didn't know, as you mentioned earlier, he didn't know how far to go down that road. And so you have these campaign rallies where his people are saying, Barack Obama is a Muslim. And why don't you go after Jeremiah Wright? And he doesn't know what to do. He is out of sync with the people coming to his own rallies. He is out of sync with people running his campaign, several of whom used to hate him. Because you know that Bush operatives tended to hate McCain for years here. And so you ran a campaign with no internal integrity that wasn't integrated, self-integrated, to use some sort of psychobabble term. And he ended up being nothing to no one. I mean, at least it seems that way from the polls at this point in time. And he sort of, I think, blew his one real shot at being the guy.
Look, I mean, you're making a decent case. I think, however, the reality is, if he'd gone that route, he would have been like Dole in '86. So an honorable loser. And
now he's a dishonorable loser.
Fair enough. I'm saying if here's a choice. If you go to most politicians in this town and say, would you like to be an honorable loser or a dishonorable winner? Most, I mean, by no means all, but most would probably take the dishonorable winner approach. I do think this. I do think that, I mean, leaving race out of it, which I suppose you say we couldn't do, but if you were to leave race out of it, if you're simply to identify Obama's stated positions on questionnaires, his voting record in Congress, the things he's done as a job, I think it is plausible to argue that he is the most, by background, and maybe not by temperament, but certainly by background, the most left-wing person we've ever elected to the presidency. And
you have a problem with that?
I know you don't. But in other words, I mean, I think that just to say, on a scale of 1 to 10, if you were to put, Franklin Roosevelt on a 1 to 10, with 1 being the most left and 10 being the most right, put Franklin Roosevelt to say a 3, and
well, God, I mean, I think you'd have to give him more than a 3 there in that scale. I mean, this guy, gave us Social Security, and he legalized
one being most liberal.
Beer.
One being most liberal.
Yeah. That's
okay, so let's put Roosevelt as a 3. Okay.
I thought higher up.
Okay, 4. I mean, okay, we can argue about the number.
Okay.
Say you can say Roosevelt's a moderate. I mean, in some way.
No. I mean closer to 1 is what I'm saying.
Oh, okay. Higher. So let's call him a 2. Okay, call him a 2. Let's call Roosevelt a 2. We're gonna develop the Corn-Pinkerton standard here, and by which we'll put presidents. And let's say Roosevelt was FDR was a 2, and let's say Reagan was an 8. How's that?
9.
Okay. I don't agree with that. I don't think Reagan was, but okay, let's say 8.5, just for the purposes here. Now, by background, in terms of what we know so far, where would you put Obama?
Probably 2.
Okay. See, okay.
FDR was a great president. People loved FDR.
I would call him a 1.5.
Okay, so
or 1 even.
Okay.
And now, in other words, and then the other 40 presidents, if you count Grover Cleveland as just one, the other 40 individuals, not all of whom you can really identify their ideology, given the fact that, like, William Henry Harrison died, a month into office and so on.
Right.
Other 40 presidents fit somewhere.
Let's call this a modern scale. I mean, I don't want to start judging a modern scale. I don't want to start judging Thomas Jefferson and John Adams on the Corn-Pinkerton scale.
Fair enough. I'm saying we are making, just for fun, and this is not a trick question, where would you put Bush on that, George W. Bush on that scale?
Well, it's kind of hard because I think, we haven't defined our terms in conservative. I mean, he is roundly seen as a conservative, but on pure conservative principles, small government, he wasn't, he wasn't there. In terms of helping corporations and the well-to-do, which liberals tend to believe tend to see as a conservative principle, he'd be very high. But on foreign policy, again, you have that split between realists such as yourself and neocons, and so no one knows. God, my phone will turn off. There it goes. So I think he's a pretty hard one to put on a linear scale. I think we need Euclidean geometry to plot Bush here. But if we're looking for a good to bad scale, I'd put him on a 9 towards the bad end.
I wouldn't defend him very hard.
Listen, I mean, let's get away from the scale for a second. I mean, I take your point. I think Barack Obama, on the basis of his background, is one of the more liberal guys entering the presidency. And it seems to me, after 8 years of a president who at least on economic issues, if you talk about taxation and regulation, was conservative in terms of foreign policy, fell into at least one very profound conservative camp. The public is saying, and in terms of environmentalism, wanted laissez-faire solutions, which you might call conservative. The public is basically saying, we've had enough. We've had enough of that. And, maybe they prefer a Democrat who was a little less liberal than Barack Obama, but maybe not. They certainly are looking for a fellow who has certain character and temperamental issues. And they're, it's the same thing. You go back looking at Reagan's wins in 80 and 84, the argument that liberals made, and I think there's some merit to it, was that the voters weren't just reacting to his conservative appeal, but to his character appeal. And they and some might have even accepted his. At the time, he was considered a pretty conservative candidate. Might have accepted his conservatism because they liked other aspects of him, and they liked what they saw was a strength of character. I think people look at Barack Obama, a lot of people, that is, not all, and they see a certain type of strength there as well. And if it's strength applied towards liberal policy ends, that's fine by them, as long as it's somewhat strength and steadiness. I don't think they have a very good idea, a lot of people, I certainly don't, about what's the best way to heal our economy right now. But, I think they want somebody who will try, will at least be firm in an approach. And he demonstrated that more so than John McCain this time around.
I agree with that. I think the challenge they're up against is do people see, for all the rejection, the obvious rejection of George W. Bush and the obvious rejection of the status quo, do people trust the government as an efficacious tool for accomplishing things? And to me, that's still a huge open question.
I agree, but I think there are, I think there's sort of a bipolar approach here amongst many of our fellow citizens, and that is, they want to rail against the government, and they see it as often being ineffective or geared more towards special interests. However they define special interests, people define it differently. But at the same time, in times of hardship and crisis, they look to government to try to help them, at least. They may not want government helping other people who they think can get by without help, but they want some help. And on healthcare issues, on economic issues, it's a push me, pull you, I think, approach or a way of thinking about the government. It's not, always logical. It's not always linear. It's like, I forget who told the story now, some politician about an elderly woman who came up to him once and said, "You get government away from my Social Security." I mean, that kind of encapsulates it. People want the Social Security, but they also don't want, they think government's the problem. And Barack Obama's challenge, this may be in a be careful what you wish for category, is to come in at a time when there are, tremendous demands being put on political leaders and those who govern us, and having to come up with some solutions, and whether it's how to deal with what's happening in Iraq and perhaps even more so in Afghanistan, let alone any other, crisis that may or may not arise, and how to deal with an economy where it's, we look around and it's hard to find an obvious path out of the hole our economy seems to have fallen into. My guess is, and it's just a hunch, and I'd be interested what you'd say to this, is that people out there are willing to give, the next president, presuming it's Barack Obama particularly here, a chance. a chance to see if government can work, if that person can make government work, and see what can happen. I don't think there's a big window. I think people will get disappointed, upset very quickly, and if they don't see things changing. And of course there will be mistakes, as there always are in a new administration, and the other side will make it a big point to play up those mistakes, and that may or may not affect how people perceive what is happening in the White House and in Congress. But there may be a little opening for sort of like a Missouri approach, show me, a show me attitude, but actually an honest show me attitude. I'd like to be shown, and I'm willing to be shown.
Right. I mean, William Galston and Elaine Kmart, who are two sort of new Democrat types, or Democratic Leadership Council, moderate Democrats, have a paper that is coming soon, I think, or maybe it's already been published, on the advice to the new president. He ought to pick Obama, that is, pick one or two sort of single concrete things that sort of can get done, and focus on those as a way of sort of having a confidence-building measure that larger projects can get done. I
would agree entirely. If there's something you can do on healthcare, maybe drug reimportation, so people can get cheaper drugs from Canada. It doesn't have to be a big fix. It doesn't have to be a fix that will work over the long run, but it will just show that we're taking steps in that direction.
Right.
And that brings brings onto the stage the other big issue of the election here. That is, how big a majority can the Democrats achieve in the Senate? Right now they have basically a 2-seat majority, and they have 51 votes. They need to get to 60 for it to be filibuster proof. And I was just looking the other day at the list, as I'm sure you've been, and basically there are no Democratic seats at risk. They thought Mary Landrieu in Louisiana might be, but she seems to be in a good position right now. And there are 12 Republican seats at risk. It looks like at least 5, 6, 7 of them are pretty good bets for the Democrats. So the question is, we talked earlier about this being a wave election, how big the wave is, and does it get them those extra 2 or 3 seats they need to get to 60?
And then, of course, that's a classic example of be careful what you wish for.
It could be. Then listen. Then the Democrats will control, the 2 of the 3 branches of government, and they won't have much of an excuse for not getting things done.
And they'll have to be answerable for what they do. I mean, I think the two sort of archetypes here for this new president and a Democratic Congress in 1993 and 1977. In 1977, Jimmy Carter had overwhelming Democratic majorities.
That was the post-Watergate election. The Democrats just won anything. Anybody who had a D in front of their name.
Right. And I think Carter came in with something like 290 seats in the House, and I think 61 in the Senate. Mm-hmm. By contrast, Bill Clinton came in with 250 or something in the House, and I think 56 in the Senate. And all the difference in the world in that, obviously, in the Senate margin with the filibuster and so on. So I think the question is, whether again, if the Democrats get close to 60 or over 60, and I agree they might, I think that again, this will be it'll be up to Obama or the president to restrain all the interest groups in his own party, and whether he can do that or not, and whether he wants to.
I do think, that Democrats, to some degree, I don't want to overstate this, to some degree, learn from history, and maybe Republicans will after this election as well. And that is, if you look back, people saw what had happened during the 1980 race between Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter, and Hillary Clinton did not emulate that. I mean, it was very present earlier in this year amongst Democratic minds about that type of disastrous inter-party fight after when the race was more or less decided. If you look back at the beginning of the Bill Clinton years, you mentioned January 1993, Bill Clinton got bogged down with gays in the military, and the Democratic lions of the Senate, not Ted Kennedy I'm talking about, but other people who had been there a long time, saw this young fellow, younger than them, come into president, the first baby boomer, and they kind of basically said, well, we're co-equal here. And they gave him a very tough time on that first budget. And you can remember Senator Bob Kerrey, who lost to Bill Clinton in the primaries for the presidential nomination, being the last Democrat to decide whether he would vote for the Bill Clinton budget. And he ended up not telling anybody what he was going to do. He went to watch the movies at Union Station. It was basically a real petulant pain in the ass. And he ended up voting for it. But it sort of set a tone in which Bill Clinton would be kind of at odds with the Democratic Senate. This time around, just looking at some of the personalities involved, Harry Reid is running the Senate, and Dick Durbin, who's number 2, who's from Illinois and very close to Barack Obama. And also looking, I think, at the seriousness of the times, my guess is that some of the natural tendencies that would totally sabotage and blow up a Democratic administration early on might be lessened. I didn't say they wouldn't be there, but maybe they might be lessened. And so, and the one other thing I think you have to give Barack Obama tremendous credit for, and to the David Plouffe and David Axelrod, his manager and strategist, is that they've really been big thinkers and plotting out his rise to his potential rise to the presidency, and they just seem to be pretty smart guys, and they've worked well with the rest of their party. They handled Hillary, I think, pretty well, and I would have high hopes, and I'm pretty hard to please, but I would have high hopes that they could somehow come out with an early strategy of the sort that you mentioned, and I want to read Elaine and Will's paper now, that will somewhat raise what I think the long odds for some early successes.
That's interesting. Of course, one thing that jumps out as if I heard you correctly, and please stop me if I'm mischaracterizing you, is you hope that the Congress, the Democrats in control Congress, will work closely with the new president to the point of a little bit of subordination to his agenda.
No. I would say partner. I think the new president has to figure out how has to do what he needs to do to stroke the people he needs to stroke. But I think what I would hope is that they actually come up with a joint strategy that they kind of agree on, and if there are things they disagree on, they figure out how to put that aside, at least initially.
Well, okay, because I mean, I think that if we play back the tape, it would sound more like you sort of hope that Reid and Pelosi will go along with Obama.
I actually think that their agendas are not that far apart. To me, these issues tend to be more turf oriented than policy minded or ideologically minded.
What's interesting is I'm going to make a prediction that is the Republicans, if they lose, are going to rediscover the Constitution. They're going to rediscover the dangers of executive branch
power,
hubris, and overreach, and all those bad things, which they were acutely aware of in the 90s, kind of forgot under George W. Bush. And now the one thing to be said in favor of conservatives rediscovering the Constitution is that actually is kind of the way the Constitution was written. I've just noticed a couple little straws in the wind. Mickey Edwards, who's a former Republican congressman from Oklahoma, a controversial figure inside the Republican Party, has a new book.
Not so new now, but yes.
Well, it has a recent book, and basically it's an argument for congressional power.
Yeah, no. He's been very angry. I mean, I've seen him speak about the Republicans in Congress basically bending over for Bush and Cheney.
Right, and Bruce Fein, who's a conservative libertarian legal scholar type, he was involved with the Ron Paul campaign.
And he was at the Heritage Foundation for years. He served in the Reagan
FCC and stuff. He's Justice Department too. He's a very, very smart guy. Has written a new book on the title something like Constitutional Emergency, and he's in the process of creating a group called First Branch. Yeah. Now, Third Branch is a reasonably well-known conservative group founded by a guy named Manuel Miranda, who that Third Branch takes its title from the judiciary, which in the Constitution comes under Article 3, as in Article 1 is the Congress, Article 2 is the presidency, Article 3 is the judiciary. And Miranda's point, and many conservatives feel this way, is that past judges have way overreached their power, and judges need to be reminded that they're actually third in line in the Constitution. And, of course, so that presidency is second, and, of course, the Congress is first. Right. And so I think that you're so between Mickey Edwards and Bruce Fine and the one place where Republicans will still have a loud, active voice in January 2009, most likely, is the legislature. And I think you're going to see an enormous upsurge in enthusiasm for parliamentarism, proceduralism, nitpickyism, and so on. I mean, it will be a new kind of a new style of Republican, getting away from gut and instinct and moral clarity and all that stuff, back to the more Burkean values of,
that may be, Jim, but at the same time, I think on the Republican side, and correct me if you think I'm wrong here, I think you're going to see an orgy of recriminations and a complete crack-up between people will be pointing fingers. There is no natural political error, either on the presidential level or even on the congressional level. I mean, what happens to John Boehner when he loses seats in the House? What happens to Mitch McConnell if he manages even to win an election of his own in Kentucky? He's on the ropes there, but loses 8 seats in the Senate. I mean, there's going to be in the House side, you have a pretty large conservative caucus led by Mike Pence and others who will be calling for blood. And I think there's going to be before they can all settle, the Republican caucuses in the House and Senate, on these wonderful Burkean values and an adherence to constitutional principalism, they're going to have to figure out who they're going to knife in the back first.
David, restrain your enthusiasm, please.
I'll be crying all the way along watching this.
I think there will clearly be some, and there may well be some changes in the leadership.
Until Barack Obama starts doing things that the Republicans can react against, which will take a little while. What will the Republican Party be standing for?
Well, I think one clear division line running through the party is the bailout. I think every day now, and I suspect that you and I were both opposed to the bailout. I'm not sure. I know I was. I don't think you and I talked about it, but okay, it's interesting. So I mean, there's a
it's a populist
divide. There's an area where right-minded people of all persuasions can come to agreement on that. And the one point that I made at the time, and I've been making ever since, is this bailout and all the sort of ancillary. We sort of lost track of how many times AIG has been bailed out and so on and so on. I think the new total is $122 billion, and they burned through most of that apparently. So who knows what's coming next? Is that muckrakers and nitpickers and everybody else with open eyes is going to see that many of the exact same people who got rich the first time around, squandering billions and trillions of dollars, are going to get at least somewhat richer the second time around by overseeing the bailout.
Now, I think the bailout gives the Republicans an opportunity. I actually thought before the first debate, I was waiting to see. I thought there was one way that McCain might be able to totally change the electoral map around. That was to come out against the bailout.
I agree.
And and he even said a few things prior to the first debate and the day before that, which indicated he might head in that populist direction, become the William Jennings Bryan of the Republican Party. And he ended up not doing that and not listening to the House conservatives who from a conservative perspective were against the bailout. But so Barack Obama inherits this bailout, as do the Democratic leaders of Congress, the House and the Senate, and they're going to have to be very careful how to play this and whether they can put on enough conditions and transparency and have enough oversight and inspector generals running everywhere to make sure that the scenario that you and I both fear that you just described, is minimized and doesn't happen. And it does give the Republicans, if they can coalesce behind that position, which they weren't able to previously, an opportunity here.
Right. By the way, speaking of populism, and I speak as I very much enjoyed Michael Kazin's biography a few years ago of William Jennings Bryan. I actually reviewed it for the American Conservative magazine, and of course we've all been struck by the fact that the states that William Jennings Bryan carried back in his three elections in 1896, 1900, and 1808 are pretty much the Republican base now, and the states that McKinley or Roosevelt carried are sort of pretty much the Democratic base. So if you invert Bryan, you pretty much have contemporary politics. Did you happen to read Mark Schmidt's piece on Obama's populism in the American Prospect just a few days ago?
You're embarrassing me. No, I haven't read anything this week because I'm so
fair enough. You and the Blocking Heads family can enjoy it. I mean, he said, look, Mark's a smart guy.
Yes, he is.
He's a former fellow here at the New American Foundation.
He's your fellow, yes.
A fellow, and a great guy. And an early voice saying not only was Obama a good guy and things like that, but actually Obama was likely to win. I can remember in the absolute doldrums for Obama in 2000, sort of like summer to fall of 2007, when Obama seemed to be sort of a steady, 10 or 15 points behind Hillary in the race, and I think, I can remember people, sort of smart people in Washington, saying there's a 95% chance that Hillary's going to get the nomination. Right. Mark Schmidt was one of those saying no, just wait and see, and he was right. So he's got to get kudos for the most difficult thing.
I'm happy to give Mark kudos.
Fine. But I will say this: what struck me though was he seemed to have coined a phrase, and I don't know that he actually coined it, and he didn't say that he did. We called it communitarian populism. I mean, it was sort of a liberal it was sort of a watered down populism to the point of not really, in my mind, at least being populist, in the sense that populism is seen as having a hard edge to it. Right. As in, us against them, vote if you shot, wave a bloody shirt, that kind of. That sort of.
You're being played for a sucker. Don't let it happen. That's sort of the essence of populism.
Right. So. Anyway, I mean, Mark argued that Obama doesn't have that kind of populism. He's got the kind of populism of we're all in this together. Now, that's, he's entitled to make that argument, and Obama is entitled to do things his way. What I wonder about, though, is if Bob Rubin, Larry Summers, Hank Paulson, and Phil Graham all agree on something, there ought to be a bailout. And then are the rest of us supposed to say, "Oh yes, we're all in this together"?
No, that's right. You and I agree on this, Jim.
Right. So there's
makes for a boring conversation.
Right. McCain made a huge mistake in not opposing the bailout.
Yeah,
we agree on that.
That was actually my fear, that he would see the wisdom of opposing the bailout, and that would cause a lot of dilemmas for progressive populists such as myself. And when he came out in the first 5 minutes of that first debate and basically said, the bailout's fine by him, my phone rang, because I had been talking about this to several people, and they all said, "See, he didn't do it." I said, well, I guess it was just, there's just too much. Sometimes it's just too hard to go against the conventional wisdom and the bipartisan consensus of power.
Too many lobbyists in his campaign.
And too many, he didn't have, that type of guts.
But now it'll be President Obama.
That was then.
That was then. And fortunately, the fun thing about politics is that you get a chance to bury your mistakes, and if your opponent keeps them alive, then they become his mistakes, or his defects in your view, and in my view. So it will be interesting to see how the Obama administration deals with what I will predict is a steady stream of outrages, where on his watch. These Wall Street CEOs are paying themselves $1 billion bonuses and taking trips to luxury resorts and buying each other and using the money, the bailout money, not to make loans but to buy other companies and so on.
This morning I was talking with Arnie Arnson, who's a talk show host in New Hampshire, and we got into a similar conversation for some reason or another, and I said, the one thing that Obama, or even if it's McCain, the next president has to do when the first jobs, which should be a big part of the transition, is making sure, who's ever in charge of the various bailouts that we have going on now and say there's a government deal that helps Chrysler and GM merge and whatever else comes down the road here, they're going to have to make sure they're appointing, inspector generals, ombudsmen, hire muckraking journalists. I could suggest a few who would just really vet everything inside out. More transparency and more oversight. Basically have Henry Waxman, sitting in on any meeting he wants to at Treasury, to just it would be in Obama's or McCain's benefit to do it that way. So that you talk about communitarian populism, this would be share the corporate socialism, at least share the responsibility for it. So that if it does go awry and there are abuses and misuses of the money, which there will be, the question is how much and how bad.
Right. I agree with you. I think that look at whoever the next administration is. And
so Elaine should put that and Will into their memo.
It's not Will Marshall. It's Bill Galston.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that this whole bailout should have been done in a glass cube. Yeah. On eBay and fully transparent, and the mere fact that what's going on now every day is a secret meeting where the banks hear this and the insurance companies hear that and get to say this in return. I mean, for the life of me, I don't understand why there hasn't been more investigation over the presence, as reported by the New York Times, of the CEO of Goldman Sachs in the room at the New York Fed when the decision was made to bail out AIG, which Goldman Sachs had a $20 billion stake in. So, in other words, why? I mean, to me, that's that's teapot dome level.
You weren't at that meeting?
I don't think you were either.
I overslept. Although I watched it on C-SPAN.
Well, I mean, if you did watch it on C-SPAN,
no. But it should be on. But the point is, it should be on C-SPAN. And it gets back. I liked, one line I liked. That Obama had on the campaign trail in the primaries. He talked about, I think he was talking about putting together a health plan. He pulled people together and that he would have TV cameras in the room and people could see, who was advocating what. He would bring together the healthcare companies and hospitals and, insurance.
Well, I think that's a little, it's okay.
I'm talking about the bigger point. We're talking about doing the opposite of the energy task force that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush did. The opposite. And the opposite of the healthcare task force that Hillary ran.
Where did Obama say that? Did you really hear him say that?
No, he said that a couple of times. He said, and we'll put it on C-SPAN. Well, I think if you do Obama, Google, this thing called Google?
Yes,
Obama,
I heard of it.
Put it on C-SPAN. I bet you it pops up.
Because I can remember, I think this is the risk of crossing you up here, because I do think the Treasury bailout is so horrible and so rife with corruption, and the fact that the identical people are now being called upon to solve the problem. I mean, it's just, it transcends conflict of interest. It's just literally like having,
Well, listen, the great thing about the bailout, Jim, is we'll be able to talk about it after the election.
It's a gift that keeps giving. But it will be interesting to see. There's just one thing that do that. It's one thing to say, listen, this toxic piece of paper from, Fannie Mae or, Citibank or whoever, that was originally valued at $1 billion is now worth 50 cents. But because we like these guys and they have good lobbyists, we'll pay them $100 million, something like that. And so, in other words, Mr. and Mrs. America, you can now see that the premium we attach to well-connected companies with good lobbyists is $99,999,000. That I think would be terribly valuable. I will be. Having said that, though, it would be hard for me to imagine, although Obama's free to try, that he could actually do deliberations on policy with a TV camera or a webcam rolling. Right.
No, there are different types. But let me just, as I said, we'll be talking about the bailout, unfortunately, for many blogging heads TV episodes to come.
Right.
But elections in just a couple of days. Let me ask you this question, and then we can say our goodbyes and go vote early. That is, to me, I see this as I do see this, all the cliches, historic, generational, transformational, for a variety of reasons. I have, my criticisms of Barack Obama policy-wise. We talked about the bailout and things like that. But I see this as a if it happens, if Barack Obama gets elected on Tuesday, I will see this as a very positive moment in American history, without being Pollyannish about it, realizing that not all that glitters is entirely gold, but by and large a very positive moment, if only a moment, for America. How will you see it?
I agree. I think that Obama. Somebody made a great comparison about Obama. He's like Jackie Robinson. The legend of Jackie Robinson, the baseball player, is that there were other players in what they called back then the Negro Leagues who were actually better players.
Yeah.
But Branch Rickey, the Brooklyn Dodgers, visionary baseball owner, thought that Jackie Robinson had the best temperament, to go back to the famous phrase that we throw around so much about presidents, the best temperament to withstand the inevitable slings and arrows of racism in the St. Louis Cardinals.
That was part of the deal.
That was part of the deal. And Robinson had to have just a steely resolve to not quite turn the other cheek, but at least not respond to taunts and so on and so on. And if he'd broken that down once, the cause of integrating baseball and the larger cause of integrating American society would have been set back some period of time. If Obama once had gotten as angry and gesticulatey and feverish and scribbling and so on as McCain gets routinely
when he orders breakfast,
when he talks to Cindy, I won't say it would have cost him the election, but it would have been very, very damaging to him. And you can call that unfair, you can call it a double standard, but that's just politics. That's just life. That's just reality.
He does have a special quality that he's been able to convey. That doesn't mean he's going to end up being a great president, that he has all the right ideas. But I think he has demonstrated, without saying that he's done everything right and that he's told the truth 100% of the time, he's demonstrated a certain amount of strength and character that we're not accustomed to seeing in many of our politicians, black or white.
Right, just to quote, just so nobody doesn't feel part of the conversation. The famous quote that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr.
About FDR
said about FDR as he was riding in the carriage to his inauguration in 1933, and it's a time of crisis for America. And so somebody said to Holmes, what do you think of this new president? And Holmes famously says, second-class intellect with first-class temperament. Now, I'm not prepared to say that Obama has a second-class intellect. He seems to have a first-class intellect, but he does also seem to have a first-class temperament. I do disagree, however, on that he's got all the right ideas, or all the left ideas. But I think in the era of the A-bomb and the nuclear weapon and the button and preemptive war and so on, I think that temperament becomes even more important as a variable. 3 a.m. phone calls and so on, and it's not lost on me. It's just an observer that the smoothest, most harmonious, most effective presidential campaign in either party seems to have been the Obama campaign.
I'll be voting for Obama. Who will you be voting for?
Well, there's a secret ballot.
I'm giving you your chance here, Jim.
I'm a Republican, I'll just leave it there.
Well, you're not declaring your vote for John McCain, I'm noticing.
I'm a Republican, secret ballot.
I'm giving you a chance here. You never know. There could be an upset. I'm not going to vote for. And for all my admiration of Obama, I'm not going to vote for him. So there's always Bob Barr.
The secret ballot.
Okay.
I didn't ask you. You can ask. You're free to ask me, but
I told you I was. I don't ask for what I'm not willing to give.
Now hold on, just for fun, and we'll go. I'll let you go in a second. Is anybody in the Mother Jones family voting for Nader or who's the other? Cynthia McKinney or anybody? Have they all been corralled around Obama?
I don't. I mean, I haven't asked. But I don't know of anybody. I know of nobody voting for Ralph Nader, or I mean, let alone Cynthia McKinney. Okay. And if I found it interesting. If you look at Slate, they listed of all their 50, 60 employees, whatever they have, who they were voting for, and I think McCain got one vote, and Bob Barr got one vote, and everybody else was either Obama or I'm not a citizen.
Well, I mean, we know. I do think that the mainstream media. Well, again, we'll talk about it. We'll plenty of time to critique that. David.
Okay. Happy Election Day.
Happy Election Day. It's going to be. It's always kind of affirming for America. I think it sounds happy for a second to, think that in times of crisis we can do this 55 times or whatever it's been since.
I am tremendously looking forward to taking my 2 young daughters to the voting place on Tuesday morning, and they're excited to be going.
Very good. What on that thought, we'll reconvene sometime after the election,
yes.
When we can go back to hacking each other with
See you soon.
over Obama's appointment of Al Sharpton.
I doubt it. No last minute cheap shots. Keep it clean.
All right. Thanks, David.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.